The Chicago skyline gleamed like broken promises against the October sky, each window reflecting the harsh fluorescent dreams of a city that never learned to sleep gently. Marcus Thompson sat in his dented Honda Civic outside the gleaming towers of Sterling Enterprises, watching the parade of tailored suits and clicking heels that marked the end of another corporate day. His phone buzzed with another Uber request, but he ignored it. Tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just a driver. His hands, callous from years of gripping steering wheels and carrying his daughter's medical equipment, smoothed over the rental tuxedo hanging in his back seat. The fabric felt foreign, like wearing someone else's skin. In 2 hours, he would walk into a world where his monthly rent was less than what they spent on a bottle of wine, where his daughter's asthma medication cost more than their dinner budget, where men like him were invisible until they were needed. The irony wasn't lost on him. Marcus Thompson, who had once stood before classrooms full of restless teenagers, teaching them about the American dream and the power of democracy, was now being paid to pretend he belonged in a world that had systematically excluded him. But Emma needed her inhaler refilled, and the electricity bill was overdue, and dignity was a luxury he couldn't afford. His phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Thompson, this is Sarah Mitchell, assistant to Miss Catherine Sterling. You spoke with our office about tonight's event? Marcus cleared his throat. Yes, ma'am. Miss Sterling will meet you in the lobby at 7:30. You have the details about the Whitmore Foundation Gala? I do. He'd spent the afternoon researching it online at the public library. The Whitmore Foundation, Chicago's most prestigious charitable organization, hosted an annual gala that raised millions for education initiatives. The guest list read like a who's who of Midwest power brokers. And somehow, he was about to walk into it on the arm of one of the most powerful women in the city. Excellent. One more thing. Mr. Thompson. Miss Sterling values discretion and minimal conversation. You're there to accompany her, not to participate in discussions. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Understood. Have a good evening. The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, then at his reflection in the rearview mirror. At 42, he still looked like the man who had commanded respect in a classroom, but the lines around his eyes had deepened, carved by late nights driving drunk college students home and early mornings delivering newspapers. His dark skin had taken on a grayish pallor from too many days without enough sunlight, too many meals skipped so Emma could have seconds. But his eyes still held the fire that had once made him believe he could change the world, one student at a time. Catherine Sterling's office occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Sterling Enterprises building, a testament to the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, and the decor was precisely what you'd expect from a woman who had inherited a $2 billion empire, expensive, tasteful, and utterly without warmth. She stood with her back to the door when Marcus was escorted in, her silhouette sharp against the dying light. Even from behind, she radiated the kind of controlled authority that made people instinctively lower their voices. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a flawless chignon, and she wore a black dress that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months. Mr. Thompson, she said without turning around. Her voice was crisp, professional, with just a hint of a Chicago accent that suggested she hadn't always lived in ivory towers. Thank you for accommodating the short notice. Thank you for the opportunity, Miss Sterling. She turned then, and Marcus felt his breath catch. Catherine Sterling was beautiful in the way that expensive things were beautiful, polished, perfect, and somehow untouchable. But there was something else in her green eyes, something that flickered beneath the surface like a candle flame in a hurricane. Pain, maybe, or exhaustion. Let's be clear about expectations, she said, walking to her desk, with the kind of precision that suggested every step was calculated. Tonight's event is crucial for Sterling Enterprises. We're announcing a new community investment initiative, and the board needs to see stability, competence, and partnership. Marcus nodded. I understand. Do you? She fixed him with a stare that could have cut glass. Because the last 3 men I've taken to these events have either tried to leverage the connection for business opportunities or spent the evening explaining to me how I should run my company. I'm not interested in either. I'm not looking for business opportunities, Miss Sterling. I'm looking to pay my daughter's medical bills. Something in her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. How old is your daughter? 7. She has asthma. Catherine was quiet for a moment, her fingers drumming against the mahogany desk. The arrangement is simple. You accompany me to the gala, make polite conversation when necessary, and present the appearance of stability. In return, you receive $5,000 in transportation home. $5,000. Marcus tried to keep his expression neutral, but his mind was already racing. Emma's medication for 3 months. The overdue electricity bill. Maybe even enough left over for the school supplies she needed. One more thing, Catherine continued, moving to the window again. Richard Whitmore will be there tonight. He's the foundation's chairman and Sterling Enterprises' largest outside investor. He has opinions about leadership, particularly about women in leadership. If he engages you in conversation, agree with whatever he says and redirect the topic. Marcus felt that cold feeling in his stomach again. And if he asks my opinion about something, then you politely defer to me. She turned back to him, and for a moment, he saw something vulnerable in her eyes. Mr. Thompson, I've worked for 15 years to prove I belong in this position. I can't afford to have that undermined by unexpected variables. The words stung more than they should have. Marcus had heard variations of this theme his entire life. Be quiet. Don't rock the boat. Know your place. But he needed this money, and Emma needed her medication. I understand, he said quietly. Good. Sarah will escort you to the car. We leave in 20 minutes. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was held at the Drake Hotel, a Chicago institution that had hosted presidents and kings. The ballroom was a study in understated opulence. Crystal chandeliers that threw rainbows across cream-colored walls, tables draped in silk, and enough flowers to stock a small botanical garden. The crowd was exactly what Marcus had expected. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos and women in dresses that cost more than most people's cars, all moving through the space with the casual confidence of those who had never questioned their right to be there. Marcus walked beside Catherine, hyper-aware of every step, every glance, every whispered conversation that seemed to pause as they passed. He'd been to formal events before, faculty dinners, school board meetings, his own wedding, a lifetime ago. But this was different. This was theater, and he was playing a role he'd never auditioned for. Relax, Catherine murmured as they approached the reception table. You look like you're walking to your execution. Feels like it, Marcus replied, then immediately regretted the honesty. But Catherine's lips curved in what might have been a smile. The trick is to remember that most of these people are just as insecure as you are. They're just better at hiding it. They were announced at the entrance, Miss Catherine Sterling and Mr. Marcus Thompson, and Marcus felt hundreds of eyes turn their way. He'd never been studied so intently by so many people, and he understood now why animals froze when caught in headlights. Miss Sterling! A woman in her 60s approached, diamonds glittering at her throat. How wonderful to see you. And you must be Marcus. I'm Eleanor Whitmore, Richard's wife. Marcus shook her hand, noting the way she assessed him with the kind of polite scrutiny that wealthy women had perfected over generations. Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore. Marcus works in transportation, Catherine said smoothly. We met through mutual friends. How lovely. Richard is so looking forward to chatting with you both. He's been following Sterling Enterprises' community initiatives with great interest. As Eleanor moved away, Marcus leaned close to Catherine. Transportation? Would you prefer I tell them you're an Uber driver? The question hit harder than it should have. Marcus had never been ashamed of honest work, but he understood the game they were playing. In this world, perceptions mattered more than reality. They moved through the crowd, Catherine introducing him to investors, board members, and Chicago's social elite. Marcus smiled, shook hands, and made the kind of small talk that revealed nothing while saying everything about your position in the social hierarchy. He was good at it, he realized. Years of parent-teacher conferences and school board meetings had taught him how to read a room, how to project confidence, even when he felt like an imposter. But the real test came when they reached Richard Whitmore. Richard Whitmore was exactly the kind of man Marcus had expected. Silver-haired, with the kind of tan that came from golf courses and Caribbean vacations, wearing a tuxedo that fit like it had been sewn directly onto his body. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, and his eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who had spent decades turning money into more money. "Catherine, my dear," he said, kissing her cheek with the casual familiarity of someone who had known her since she was a child. "You look radiant, and this must be Marcus." "Mr. Whitmore," Marcus replied, accepting the handshake. "Please, call me Richard. Any friend of Catherine's is a friend of mine." His eyes studied Marcus with the kind of assessment that made Marcus feel like a stock being evaluated. "Catherine tells me you work in transportation." "What sector?" Marcus felt Catherine's slight tension beside him. "I work with people," he said carefully, making sure they get where they need to go safely. "Ah, logistics, the backbone of commerce." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me, Marcus, what's your take on legacy leadership? You know, the idea that certain families, certain bloodlines, have an inherent advantage in business?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus felt Catherine's warning look, remembered her words about agreeing and redirecting. But something in Richard's tone, something in the way he phrased the question, made Marcus's teacher instincts kick in. This wasn't really about business theory. This was about Catherine, about her right to lead her father's company. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that legacy is only as strong as the person carrying it forward." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "Interesting. And what about inherited positions? Do you believe some people are simply born to lead?" Marcus glanced at Catherine, saw the warning in her eyes, and made a choice that would change everything. "I've spent a lot of time working with young people," he said, his voice carrying the authority he'd once wielded in a classroom. "And I've learned that leadership isn't about bloodlines or inheritance. It's about courage, integrity, and the willingness to make hard choices when no one is watching." The conversation around them had quieted. Marcus was vaguely aware of other guests turning to listen, but he was focused on Richard, on the way the older man's expression had sharpened with interest. "You sound like you speak from experience," Richard said. "I do. I've seen kids from the worst neighborhoods become leaders because they understood that leadership means service, not privilege. And I've seen children of privilege fail because they thought their last name was more important than their character." A complete silence had fallen over their section of the room. Marcus could feel Catherine's tension radiating like heat, could sense the weight of attention from dozens of Chicago's most powerful people. Richard leaned forward slightly. "And what about Catherine here? What kind of leader do you think she is?" This was it. The moment that would define the evening, maybe define his relationship with Catherine entirely. Marcus could feel the expectation in the room, the sense that everyone was waiting for him to say something safe, something expected. Instead, he turned to look at Catherine, really look at her, and saw not the polished CEO but something deeper. He saw the woman who had asked about his daughter's asthma, who had warned him about the sharks in these waters, who carried herself with a kind of exhaustion that came from constantly proving herself. "I think," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "that Catherine Sterling is the kind of leader who asks the right questions, instead of assuming she has all the answers. She's someone who understands that true power comes from lifting others up, not standing on their shoulders." He paused, gathering his thoughts, and continued. "I've worked with a lot of people who inherited their positions. Most of them spend their energy trying to prove they deserve what they were given. Catherine doesn't need to prove anything. She's already earned her place by choosing to use her power responsibly." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then Richard Whitmore began to clap, slowly at first, then with genuine enthusiasm. The sound broke the spell, and suddenly the entire crowd was applauding, not the polite golf claps of social obligation, but something deeper, more real. "Beautifully said," Richard declared, his eyes bright with what looked like genuine respect. "Absolutely beautifully said." As the crowd began to disperse, returning to their conversations and cocktails, Catherine touched Marcus's arm lightly. "We need to talk," she said quietly. They found a quiet corner near the hotel's famous palm court, away from the crowd and the curious eyes. Catherine was silent for a long moment, her champagne glass untouched in her hands. "You were supposed to agree with him," she said finally. "I know. You were supposed to redirect the conversation. I know that too." She looked at him then, and Marcus saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not anger, but something more complex. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Marcus shook his head. "You made Richard Whitmore, one of the most powerful men in Chicago, applaud. You made him look at me not as James Sterling's daughter, but as Catherine Sterling, CEO. Her voice was barely above a whisper. No one has ever done that before. I just told the truth. The truth. She laughed, but it was a sound without humor. Do you know how long it's been since someone told the truth about me in a room full of people? Marcus studied her face, seeing the exhaustion and vulnerability she usually kept hidden. Why did you really hire me tonight, Catherine? She was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might not answer. Then she said, because I was tired of standing alone. Because I thought having someone beside me might make me feel less like I was drowning. She looked at him directly. I didn't expect you to throw me a life preserver. Is that what I did? I don't know yet. She finished her champagne in one swallow. But I know I owe you an apology. I hired you to be invisible. To be safe. Instead, you were real. And that's not something I'm used to. Before Marcus could respond, Eleanor Whitmore appeared at Catherine's elbow. Catherine, dear, Richard is about to make the announcement about the Foundation's new education initiative. He specifically requested that you and Marcus join him on stage. Catherine's eyes widened. On stage? Oh, yes. He was quite insistent. He said Marcus's perspective on leadership and community was exactly what the Foundation needed to hear. As Eleanor led them toward the stage, Marcus felt Catherine's hand slip into his. Her skin was cool, her grip tight with nervousness. I have no idea what's about to happen, she whispered. Then we'll figure it out together, Marcus replied. It was the first time he'd used the word we in reference to the two of them, and something about it felt both terrifying and exactly right. The stage at the Drake Hotel's ballroom was smaller than Marcus had expected, but under the focused lighting, it felt enormous. He stood beside Catherine, acutely aware of the hundreds of faces turned toward them, of the weight of expectation and curiosity that filled the room like humidity. Richard Whitmore approached the podium with the confidence of someone who had been commanding attention for decades. His voice carried easily through the room as he began to speak about the Foundation's work, about the importance of education and community investment. Tonight, he said, his eyes finding Marcus and Catherine in the crowd, we've been reminded that leadership comes in many forms. Sometimes it comes from boardrooms and corner offices. Sometimes it comes from classrooms and communities. But true leadership always comes from the courage to speak truth, especially when that truth is uncomfortable. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't what he'd expected when he'd agreed to wear a tuxedo and play escort for an evening. I'd like to invite Catherine Sterling and Marcus Thompson to share their thoughts on what community investment really means, Richard continued, because I believe they have something important to say about the intersection of business and social responsibility. The applause was polite but expectant. Marcus felt Catherine's hand find his again, and he squeezed it gently as they approached the podium. Catherine spoke first, her voice clear and confident despite the tremor Marcus could feel in her hand. When my father built Sterling Enterprises, he believed that business success and community health were inseparable. Tonight, I want to announce Sterling Enterprises' commitment to that principle through our new community partnership initiative. She outlined the program: job training, educational scholarships, small business loans for underserved communities. It was comprehensive, well-planned, and represented a significant financial commitment. But Marcus could hear the corporate speak in her words, the carefully constructed language that said everything and nothing. When she finished, Richard stepped forward. And Marcus, as someone who works directly with community members, what would you add to Catherine's vision? Marcus looked out at the crowd, at the faces that represented more wealth and power than he'd ever imagined being in the same room with. For a moment, he felt the familiar urge to shrink, to say something safe and forgettable. Then he thought about Emma, about the other kids in her school who came to class hungry, about the parents he'd taught who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford their children's medications. He thought about the students he'd lost to despair, and the ones he'd saved with nothing more than attention and belief. I appreciate everything Miss Sterling has outlined, he began, his voice carrying the authority he'd developed over years of teaching. But I want to add something that often gets lost in discussions about community investment. He paused, gathering his thoughts, and continued. The communities you're talking about helping, they're not broken. They're not problems to be solved. They're networks of people who have been surviving and thriving despite systems that were designed to exclude them. The room was completely silent. Marcus could see Catherine watching him intently, her expression unreadable. Real community investment doesn't start with asking, how can we help these people? It starts with asking, how can we learn from these people? How can we create genuine partnerships instead of charity? He looked directly at Richard, then at Catherine. I've seen programs that spend millions of dollars and change nothing because they were designed by people who never asked the community what they actually needed. And I've seen programs that cost almost nothing but transformed lives because they were built on respect, on listening, on recognizing that every person has something valuable to contribute. Marcus felt the energy in the room shift. People were leaning forward, hanging on his words in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Miss Sterling's initiative is a good start, he continued. But it will only succeed if Sterling Enterprises approaches it as a partnership, not a charity project. If they're willing to be changed by the communities they're working with, not just trying to change them. He paused, looking out at the crowd of Chicago's elite, and made a decision that would echo through the rest of his life. Because here's what I learned in 15 years of teaching in underserved schools. The kids who were written off by the system, they weren't failing because they lacked potential. They were failing because the system never bothered to recognize the potential they had. The silence that followed was different from the polite quiet of earlier. This was the silence of people processing something unexpected, something that challenged their assumptions. Then Richard Whitmore began to clap, and the sound was like a dam breaking. The applause that followed was thunderous, sustained, and genuine. Marcus felt Catherine's hand tighten on his, and when he looked at her, he saw tears in her eyes. "Thank you," Richard said as the applause died down. "Thank you both for reminding us that true leadership means having the courage to question our assumptions and the wisdom to learn from unexpected teachers." As they left the stage, Marcus felt the weight of what had just happened settling on his shoulders. He'd spoken his truth to a room full of people who had the power to change lives, and somehow, they'd listened. But the real test would come in the car ride home, when he had to face Catherine and find out whether he'd helped her or destroyed everything she'd been trying to build. The ride back to Marcus's neighborhood was silent for the first 10 minutes. The only sound, the quiet hum of the town car's engine and the distant noise of Chicago traffic. Catherine sat in the corner of the back seat, her designer clutch in her lap, staring out the window at the city lights. Marcus couldn't read her expression, couldn't tell if she was angry, thoughtful, or simply exhausted. Finally, she spoke. 15 years. I'm sorry? You said you taught in underserved schools for 15 years. When did you stop? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. 3 years ago, budget cuts. The district eliminated a lot of positions, and I was one of the newer hires. And since then, I've been doing whatever pays the bills. Uber, delivery driving, some construction work when my back allows it. He paused. Not exactly the career trajectory they talk about in education school. Catherine turned to face him. Why didn't you tell me you were a teacher? You didn't ask. And honestly, it didn't seem relevant. You needed an escort, not a resume. Everything you said tonight about community investment, about partnerships instead of charity, that came from experience. It came from watching a lot of well-meaning programs fail because they were designed by people who never lived in the communities they were trying to help. Catherine was quiet for another long moment. My father used to say that the most dangerous person in a boardroom is someone who has nothing to lose. Marcus felt a chill. Are you saying I was dangerous tonight? I'm saying you were honest. In my world, that's the same thing. The car turned onto Marcus's street, a narrow strip of modest houses and apartment buildings that had seen better decades. Marcus suddenly felt embarrassed, imagining how it must look to someone who lived in a downtown penthouse. This is fine, he said as they approached his building. You don't need to. I want to see where you live, Catherine interrupted. If we're going to work together, I should understand your world. Work together? She looked at him steadily. Did you think tonight was a one-time thing? After what you set up there, after the way Richard responded? Marcus, you just became the most valuable asset Sterling Enterprises has. The car stopped in front of his building, a 3-story walk-up that had been converted into apartments sometime in the 1980s. Marcus climbed out, then held the door for Catherine. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in the neighborhood, the corner store with its multilingual signs, the kids' bikes chained to the front steps, the sound of television and conversation drifting from open windows. It's not much, Marcus said. It's real, Catherine replied. When's the last time you think I was somewhere real? They climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment, Marcus's keys jingling in the quiet hallway. Inside, the space was small but clean, filled with the kind of furniture that had been purchased for function rather than style. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator, and her school books were stacked neatly on the kitchen table. Emma's asleep, Marcus said quietly. She goes to bed early on school nights. Catherine moved through the small living room, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floors. She stopped at a bookshelf crammed with volumes on history, education, and social justice, many of them dog-eared and highlighted. You still study, she observed. Hard to break the habit. Besides, I keep thinking I'll get back to teaching someday. What's stopping you? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Have you seen the job market for teachers lately, especially teachers with gaps in their employment history? Catherine pulled a book from the shelf, a worn copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. This was assigned reading in my graduate program. You went to graduate school? MBA from Northwestern, my father insisted. She flipped through the pages, many of them marked with Marcus's notes. But I never really understood what Freire was talking about until tonight. What do you mean? Catherine closed the book and looked at him. He talks about the banking concept of education, the idea that teachers deposit knowledge into students like money into accounts. But real education is dialogue, partnership, mutual learning. You've been reading my notes, Marcus said with a slight smile. I've been thinking about what you said on stage, about partnerships instead of charity, about learning from communities instead of just trying to help them. She set the book down carefully. I want to hire you. You already did hire me. No, I hired you to be arm candy for an evening. I want to hire you to help me build something real. Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of pity or condescension. Instead, he saw something he hadn't expected, genuine respect. What exactly are you offering? A position as Director of Community Engagement for Sterling Enterprises. You'd be responsible for developing and implementing our community investment programs. Real programs, not public relations exercises. Marcus felt his heart skip. Catherine, I appreciate the offer, but the salary is $120,000 a year, plus benefits, health insurance that would cover Emma's medications. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. $120,000 was more than he'd ever made as a teacher, more than he'd made in the past 2 years combined. It was enough to move Emma to a better school district, to stop worrying about every doctor's visit, to maybe even start saving for her college education. Why? He asked. Because you're the first person who's ever stood up in front of Richard Whitmore and told him that his assumptions about leadership were wrong. Because you understand something about community that I've never learned. Because I need someone who will tell me the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Marcus walked to the window, looking out at the street where he'd lived for the past 3 years. Where he'd learned to navigate food stamps and Medicaid applications. Where he'd discovered that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. There's something you should know, he said without turning around, about why I really stopped teaching. Catherine waited. There was an incident. A student, a kid named Devin, came to class with bruises on his arms. I reported it, like I was supposed to. But his father was connected, had influence with the school board. The investigation was buried, and I was told to mind my own business. Marcus turned back to Catherine. I couldn't do that. I kept pushing, kept asking questions. Eventually, they found a reason to eliminate my position. What happened to Devin? He aged out of the system. Last I heard, he was in county lockup. Marcus's voice was heavy with regret. I failed him. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. You tried to protect a child. That's not failure. Tell that to Devin. Marcus. Catherine's voice was firm. What if I told you that Sterling Enterprises has enough influence to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen again? What if I told you that we could build programs that actually protect kids like Devin? I'd say that sounds too good to be true. It might be, but it's also the only way I know how to live with myself. Catherine stood, smoothing her dress. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to take a chance on the possibility that we can build something better together than either of us could alone. Marcus looked around his small apartment at the life he'd built from the wreckage of his teaching career. It wasn't much, but it was stable, predictable. Taking Catherine's offer would mean stepping back into a world that had already chewed him up once. But it would also mean Emma could have the life she deserved. "I'll need to think about it," he said. Catherine nodded. "Of course. Take your time." She paused at the door. "Marcus, thank you for tonight, for reminding me why I wanted to run this company in the first place." After she left, Marcus sat in his small kitchen, staring at the stack of bills on his table. Emma's inhaler prescription, overdue notices from the electric company, a letter from her school about field trips he couldn't afford. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. But for the first time in years, he also felt something else. Hope. In the morning, he would have to decide whether to trust Catherine Sterling with his future and his daughter's welfare. Tonight, he allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to have power to change things again, to be part of building something that mattered. In her bedroom down the hall, Emma coughed in her sleep, the sound that had become the soundtrack of Marcus's anxiety. He got up to check on her, adjusting her pillows and making sure her inhaler was within reach. "Daddy," she whispered, half awake. "How was your fancy dinner?" "It was interesting, baby. Go back to sleep." "Did you help people?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't know yet. Maybe." Emma smiled sleepily. "I hope you did. You're good at helping people." As Marcus kissed his daughter's forehead and tucked her blanket around her shoulders, he realized that his decision was already made. The question wasn't whether he could afford to take Catherine's offer. The question was whether he could afford not to. The Sterling Enterprises building looked different at 8 in the morning than it had at night. In the harsh light of a Chicago winter dawn, the glass and steel seemed less intimidating, more like what it actually was, a place where people worked, made decisions, and tried to build something meaningful. Marcus stood on the sidewalk outside, clutching a coffee that had already gone cold, watching the stream of employees flowing through the revolving doors. 3 weeks had passed since the Whitmore Foundation Gala, 3 weeks of sleepless nights and careful consideration. Emma's asthma had flared up twice, sending them to the emergency room both times. The bills were mounting, and Marcus had finally swallowed his pride and called Catherine. "I accept your offer," he'd said simply. "I'm glad," she'd replied, and something in her voice suggested she meant it. "Can you start Monday?" Now it was Monday, and Marcus was about to walk into a world he'd never imagined belonging to. He wore his best suit, not the rental tuxedo from the gala, but a navy blue suit he'd bought for job interviews that had never materialized. It was pressed and clean, but it couldn't hide the fact that he was still an outsider stepping into a realm of privilege and power. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending through layers of society. Each floor that passed represented another level of wealth and influence he'd never been part of. By the time the doors opened onto the executive level, Marcus's palms were sweating. Sarah Mitchell, Catherine's assistant, was waiting for him. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of efficient demeanor that suggested she'd been managing executives longer than Marcus had been alive. "Mr. Thompson," she said with a warm smile, "welcome to Sterling Enterprises. Miss Sterling is in a board meeting, but she asked me to show you to your office and get you settled." Marcus followed her down a corridor lined with oil paintings and windows that offered stunning views of Lake Michigan. The office she led him to was larger than his apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows, a mahogany desk, and a sitting area with leather chairs. "This is mine?" he asked, unable to keep the amazement out of his voice. "Miss Sterling insisted on one of the corner offices," Sarah replied. "She said you'd need space for community meetings, and that the view would remind you why this work matters." Marcus walked to the window, looking out over the city that sprawled toward the horizon. From this height, he could see the neighborhoods where he taught, where he still lived, where families struggled to make ends meet. The distance between this office and that reality felt both vast and bridgeable. "She also asked me to give you this," Sarah continued, handing him a thick folder, background information on Sterling Enterprises' previous community initiatives, demographic data on Chicago's underserved communities, and budget projections for the new programs. Marcus opened the folder, scanning pages of charts, graphs, and financial projections. The numbers were staggering. Sterling Enterprises was prepared to invest $50 million in community programs over the next 5 years. It was more money than he'd ever imagined having access to, and the responsibility felt overwhelming. "One more thing," Sarah said, settling into one of the chairs. Miss Sterling asked me to schedule a series of meetings for you this week. Community leaders, nonprofit directors, school principals, people who can help you understand what's really needed out there. Marcus looked up from the folder. She set up meetings with community leaders. She said you'd emphasize the importance of listening before acting. She wants you to have those conversations before the board meeting next Friday. What board meeting? Sarah's expression grew more serious. The one where you'll be presenting your preliminary recommendations for the Community Investment Initiative. Miss Sterling has scheduled it as the first major test of your role here. Marcus felt his stomach drop. I've been on the job for exactly 15 minutes, and I already have to present to the board? Welcome to Sterling Enterprises, Sarah said with a sympathetic smile. Miss Sterling doesn't believe in easing into things. She believes in throwing people into the deep end and seeing if they can swim. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Catherine appeared in the doorway. She wore a charcoal gray suit that made her look like she could negotiate hostile takeovers before breakfast. But when she saw Marcus, her expression softened slightly. How are you settling in? She asked. Still processing the fact that I have an office bigger than my apartment, Marcus replied. Catherine stepped into the room, and Sarah discreetly withdrew. I wanted to talk to you about expectations, Catherine said, closing the door behind her. I'm listening. The board is skeptical about this initiative. They see it as a costly experiment that might not generate measurable returns. She walked to the window, standing beside Marcus. They're also skeptical about you, because I'm not one of them. Because you're not what they expected. Richard Whitmore's endorsement carries weight, but several board members are wondering if you can translate inspiring speeches into practical programs. Marcus nodded slowly. And you? What do you think? Catherine turned to face him. I think you're exactly what this company needs. But I also think you're going to have to prove it. Over and over again. What's the real timeline here, Catherine? How long do I have to show results? Honestly, 6 months. If we can't demonstrate clear progress by then, the board will pressure me to redirect the funds to more traditional investments. 6 months. Marcus had gone from unemployment to having 6 months to prove that $50 million in community investment was worth the risk. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. There's something else, Catherine continued. Victoria Nash, our COO, has been resistant to this initiative. She's brilliant, ambitious, and she believes that Sterling Enterprises should focus on maximizing shareholder value rather than community impact. She's not wrong from a traditional business perspective. No, she's not. But she's also not right from a human perspective. Catherine's voice carried a note of frustration. She's been building alliances on the board, questioning whether this initiative is the best use of company resources. Marcus studied Catherine's face. Are you warning me about office politics? I'm warning you that Victoria sees you as a threat to her vision for the company. She's going to be looking for ways to undermine your programs. And you want me to what? Fight her? I want you to succeed so completely that her objections become irrelevant. Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock on the door. Sarah peeked in. Miss Sterling, your 10 o'clock is here. We'll continue this conversation later, Catherine said. For now, focus on those community meetings. Listen to what people really need, not what we think they need. As Catherine left, Marcus sat down at his new desk and opened the folder Sarah had given him. The data was comprehensive. Poverty rates by neighborhood, educational achievement gaps, unemployment statistics, healthcare access issues. But behind every number was a human story, a family struggling to build a better life. He thought about Emma, about the nights he'd held her while she struggled to breathe, about the choices he'd made and the opportunities he'd missed. Now he had a chance to ensure that other parents didn't have to make those same impossible choices. Marcus pulled out his phone and started making calls. If he was going to succeed, he needed to start by understanding the communities he was supposed to serve. And that meant getting out of this gleaming office and back into the neighborhoods where real life happened. The Southside Community Center occupied a converted warehouse in a neighborhood that had seen better decades. The building's brick facade was weathered but clean, and the windows were filled with colorful artwork created by local children. Marcus parked his Honda Civic between a rusted pickup truck and a minivan held together with duct tape and determination. Inside, the center buzzed with activity. Elderly men played chess in one corner, while teenagers worked on computers in another. A group of women sat in a circle, some knitting while others tended to babies. The smell of coffee and something delicious drifted from the kitchen area. "You must be Marcus Thompson," said a woman approaching him with a warm smile. She was in her 60s, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "I'm Maria Santos, the director here. Catherine Sterling said you wanted to learn about our community." Marcus shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of years of physical work. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me." "Time is something we have," Maria replied. "Money is what we don't have. Come on, let me show you around." Maria led him through the center, explaining the programs they offered with limited resources. Adult education classes, job training, childcare for working parents, a food pantry, and a small medical clinic staffed by volunteer nurses. "We serve about 500 families," Maria explained as they walked, "but we could serve twice that if we had the resources." "What's the biggest challenge you face?" Maria paused beside a bulletin board covered with job postings, most of them for minimum wage positions. "Transportation. You can't work if you can't get to work. We have people who want jobs, but they can't afford cars, and the public transit doesn't reach the areas where the jobs are." Marcus made a note. "What else?" "Childcare. We can provide it here during the day, but what about parents who work nights or weekends? They have to choose between working and leaving their kids unsupervised." They continued the tour, and Marcus began to see the intricate web of challenges that kept families trapped in poverty. It wasn't just about money, it was about access, opportunity, and the complex logistics of survival. "Can I ask you something?" Maria said as they sat in her small office. "Are you here because you want to help, or because your company needs to look good?" The question was direct, without hostility, but Marcus could hear the weight of experience behind it. "Probably both," he said honestly, "but I hope the helping part matters more." Maria smiled. "Good answer. You want to know why most corporate programs fail?" "I do. Because they're designed by people who have never been poor. They create solutions to problems they don't understand, and then they're surprised when those solutions don't work." Marcus thought about his own experience, the years of struggling to make ends meet while Emma fought her asthma. What would real help look like? Partnership. Not charity, partnership. Hire people from the community to run the programs. Pay them decent wages. Ask us what we need instead of telling us what you think we need. And if a company was serious about that kind of partnership, Maria's expression grew more interested. Then we'd have something to talk about. Marcus spent the next hour taking notes as Maria outlined the community's actual needs versus what most corporations thought they needed. By the time he left, he had a page full of ideas that looked nothing like traditional corporate social responsibility programs. His next stop was Lincoln Elementary School, where he'd once taught. The building looked smaller than he remembered, more worn down. Budget cuts had taken their toll. The playground equipment was old, the paint was peeling, and the library had been converted into additional classroom space. Principal Janet Williams greeted him in the hallway. She was a woman in her 50s who had been at Lincoln for 20 years, weathering every budget crisis and policy change with determined optimism. "Marcus Thompson," she said, pulling him into a hug. "I heard you were working with Sterling Enterprises now. Good for you." "Thanks, Janet. I wanted to get your perspective on community investment in education." Janet led him to her office, which was cramped but organized, with student artwork covering every available surface. "What do you want to know? What would make the biggest difference for your students?" Janet leaned back in her chair. "Honestly, stability. These kids move a lot because their families get evicted or have to follow work. They start the year in one school, move to another in December, and end up in a third school by spring. How are they supposed to learn?" Marcus made another note. "What about academic programs? We need tutoring, but not the kind where volunteers show up for a few weeks and then disappear. We need consistent, long-term support. We need someone who's going to be here next year and the year after that." "What about technology?" Janet laughed, but it was a tired sound. "We have computers that are 10 years old and software that barely works. But before we worry about technology, we need to worry about basics. We have kids who come to school hungry, who don't have winter coats, who can't afford school supplies." Marcus spent another hour with Janet, and by the time he left, he had a clearer picture of what schools in underserved communities actually needed. It wasn't glamorous, It was basic, fundamental support that would allow teachers to focus on teaching instead of crisis management. His final stop of the day was the Southside Youth Center, where he met with Jerome Williams, a man in his 30s who had grown up in the neighborhood and returned after college to work with local teenagers. Most of these kids are smart as hell, Jerome said as they watched a group of teenagers working on a robotics project, but they're surrounded by systems that tell them they're failures. What do you mean? They go to schools that are underfunded, they live in neighborhoods that are over-policed, and they're constantly told that their only options are minimum wage jobs or illegal activities. Meanwhile, they see people like you and me who got out, and they think we're unicorns. Marcus watched the teenagers, remembering his own students, the ones who had succeeded despite the odds and the ones who had been lost to despair. What would change that? Mentorship. Real mentorship, not some corporate volunteer program where executives show up once a month to feel good about themselves. These kids need adults who believe in them, who show up consistently, who help them navigate systems they don't understand, such as college applications, job interviews, financial aid, opening bank accounts, all the stuff that middle-class kids learn at home. These kids are just as smart, but they don't have the social capital. By the time Marcus returned to his office, it was past 7 o'clock. The Sterling Enterprises building was mostly empty, but he could see lights on in several offices, including Catherine's. He knocked on her door. "Come in," she called. Catherine was at her desk, surrounded by papers and laptops, looking like she'd been there all day. She looked up as he entered, her expression tired but alert. "How are the meetings?" she asked. Marcus sat down across from her. "Eye-opening. I have about 50 ideas and no idea how to prioritize them. Tell me the most important one. Hire from the community. If we're going to do this right, we need to employ people who understand the challenges from the inside, not just observe them from the outside." Catherine nodded slowly. "That's not how most corporate programs work. That's why most corporate programs fail." "Fair point. What else?" Marcus pulled out his notes. "Transportation is a huge barrier. People can't work if they can't get to work. Childcare is another, especially for parents who work non-traditional hours. And education needs consistent, long-term support, not short-term volunteer programs. Those are all expensive solutions. They're expensive problems. The question is whether we want to address the problems or just treat the symptoms." Catherine leaned back in her chair. 3 weeks ago, I would have pushed back on that. I would have asked about return on investment and measurable outcomes. And now I'm wondering why I ever thought there was a meaningful difference between good business and good citizenship." Marcus studied her face. "What changed?" "You did. Your speech at the gala, the way you talked about partnerships instead of charity, it made me realize that I've been thinking about this all wrong." "How so?" Catherine stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "I've been trying to run Sterling Enterprises the way my father did, focused on profit margins and shareholder value. But every time I make a decision based purely on financial metrics, I feel like I'm betraying something." "What are you betraying?" "The reason I wanted to run this company in the first place." She turned back to him. "When I was a kid, I used to come to the office with my father sometimes. I'd sit in the corner during meetings, and I'd hear him talk about building something that mattered, about using business as a force for good. What happened to that vision? He died, and I inherited a company full of people who measured success very differently." Catherine's voice carried a note of regret. "I've spent 3 years trying to prove I could be as ruthless as he was, when what I really wanted was to be as principled as he was." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "It's not too late to change course, isn't it? The board expects certain returns. Investors expect growth. Employees expect job security. How do I balance all of that with doing the right thing? Maybe the right thing is what creates sustainable growth in the long term." Catherine smiled, but it was a complicated expression. "That's very optimistic. It's also true. Companies that invest in their communities create stronger markets, more loyal customers, and better employees. The return on investment might not show up in the next quarter, but it shows up. And if the board doesn't see it that way," Marcus met her eyes, "then we have 6 months to prove them wrong." Catherine returned to her desk, pulling out a calendar. "Speaking of which, we need to prepare for Friday's board meeting." They're going to want specifics, budget allocations, timelines, measurable goals. I can have preliminary recommendations ready by Thursday. Good. And Marcus? She looked up at him. Thank you for today, for going out there and actually listening instead of just collecting data. It's what you hired me to do. It's what I hoped you would do. There's a difference. As Marcus gathered his things to leave, Catherine called after him. One more thing. Tomorrow night, there's a fundraiser for the Chicago Public Education Foundation. A lot of board members will be there, along with other business leaders. Would you like to come? Marcus hesitated. As your date again? As my colleague. I think it would be good for people to see us working together, to understand that this community investment initiative is a partnership. All right, but I'm wearing my own suit this time. Catherine laughed. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. The Chicago Public Education Foundation fundraiser was held at the Art Institute, surrounded by priceless paintings and sculptures that reminded attendees of the cultural treasures their donations supported. Marcus arrived early, wanting to get a feel for the room before the crowd gathered. He found Catherine near the Impressionist collection, standing in front of a Monet water lily painting. She wore a deep blue dress that complemented her auburn hair, and for a moment Marcus was struck by how different she looked in this setting. Less corporate, more human. Beautiful, isn't it? She said without turning around. It is. Do you come here often? My father used to bring me here when I was a child. He said that art reminded him why business mattered, to create the resources that allowed beauty to exist. Marcus studied the painting, trying to see it through the eyes of a man who had built an empire. What do you see when you look at it? Hope, I think. The idea that something beautiful can emerge from chaos. She turned to him. What do you see? I see a teacher's salary for a year, Marcus said honestly. I know that's not very poetic, but it's hard for me to look at expensive things without thinking about what that money could accomplish. Catherine was quiet for a moment. I used to think like that too, when I was younger. But my father taught me that supporting the arts was part of supporting the community. He wasn't wrong, but I bet he never had to choose between buying groceries and buying his daughter's medication. The words came out more sharply than Marcus had intended, and he immediately regretted them. But Catherine didn't look offended. Instead, she looked thoughtful. No, she said softly. He never had to make that choice. Neither have I. Before Marcus could respond, they were interrupted by a familiar voice. Catherine, how wonderful to see you here. Marcus turned to see Victoria Nash approaching, with the kind of smile that looked warm but felt calculating. She was a woman in her early 40s, impeccably dressed and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her right to be in any room. Victoria, Catherine replied, her tone polite but cooler than it had been moments before. I don't think you've met Marcus Thompson. Marcus, this is Victoria Nash, our Chief Operating Officer. Victoria extended a manicured hand. Mr. Thompson, I've heard so much about you. Miss Nash, Marcus replied, shaking her hand and noting the way she assessed him, like a chess player studying an opponent's opening move. I understand you're leading our new community investment initiative, Victoria continued. How exciting. I'd love to hear more about your background in corporate social responsibility. The question was phrased pleasantly, but Marcus could hear the trap in it. Victoria knew perfectly well that he had no background in corporate social responsibility, and she was highlighting that fact in front of Catherine. I don't have a background in corporate social responsibility, Marcus said simply. I have a background in community, which is what this initiative is actually about. Victoria's smile didn't waver. Of course. And I'm sure your unique perspective will be valuable. I just hope you understand the financial complexities involved in large-scale corporate initiatives. I understand that the financial complexities are often used as excuses for inaction. Marcus replied calmly. Catherine stepped slightly closer to Marcus, a subtle but clear signal of support. Marcus has been visiting communities throughout the city, getting first-hand information about what's actually needed. How thorough, Victoria said. I hope you're also consulting with our financial analysts about budget constraints and return on investment projections. I'm consulting with the people who will be affected by these programs, Marcus said. Their return on investment is measured in different terms. Victoria's smile finally showed some strain. Well, I look forward to seeing your recommendations at Friday's board meeting. I'm sure they'll be very idealistic. As Victoria moved away, Catherine touched Marcus's arm lightly. I should have warned you about her. She's not subtle. She doesn't need to be. She has allies on the board who agree with her philosophy. Marcus watched Victoria working the room, greeting other attendees with the kind of practiced charm that came from years of corporate networking. What's her story? She's brilliant, ambitious, and she's been with Sterling Enterprises for 8 years. She expected to be named CEO when my father died. And instead, you got the job. Instead, I inherited the job. There's a difference, and she knows it. Marcus studied Catherine's profile. Do you think she's right about the financial complexities? I think she's right that running a business requires difficult decisions about resource allocation. I think she's wrong that profitability and social responsibility are mutually exclusive. And if you're wrong, Catherine met his eyes. Then we'll fail together. The conversation was interrupted by the evening's program beginning. Marcus found himself seated at a table with Catherine, several Sterling Enterprises board members, and other Chicago business leaders. The speaker was a Chicago public schools principal who talked about the challenges facing urban education. As the principal described overcrowded classrooms, outdated textbooks, and teachers spending their own money on supplies, Marcus felt the familiar anger that had driven him as a teacher. But this time, he also felt something else, the possibility of actually doing something about it. It's heartbreaking, whispered the woman sitting next to him, a board member's wife who wore diamonds that could have funded a school library. Someone should really do something. Marcus bit back his initial response and instead leaned forward. What would you suggest? Oh, I don't know. More funding, I suppose. Better teachers. It's all very complicated. It's not that complicated, Marcus said quietly. It's just expensive, and it requires people with resources to care more about solving problems than about looking good. The woman blinked, clearly taken aback by his directness. Catherine caught his eye across the table, and he could see both admiration and concern in her expression. After the program ended, Marcus found himself in conversation with several of the other attendees. Word had spread about his role at Sterling Enterprises, and people were curious about the community investment initiative. What kind of return can investors expect? Asked a man who introduced himself as a hedge fund manager. The return is measured in lives changed, Marcus replied. How do you quantify the value of a kid who graduates from high school instead of dropping out? Or a parent who finds stable employment? But surely there must be some financial metrics. There are. Reduced crime rates, increased property values, higher consumer spending, better health outcomes that reduce healthcare costs. The question is whether you're willing to wait for those returns or whether you need immediate gratification. The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus finding himself explaining and defending the concept of long-term community investment to people who were used to thinking in quarterly profit reports. As the evening wound down, Catherine found him on the museum steps, looking out at the Chicago skyline. How are you feeling? She asked. Like I just spent 3 hours trying to convince people that human beings have inherent value beyond their economic productivity. Catherine sat down beside him on the steps. And how did that go? About as well as you'd expect. Half of them think I'm naive, and the other half think I'm dangerous. Which half is right? Marcus considered the question. Maybe both. Maybe that's what it takes to change anything. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Marcus, can I ask you something personal? Sure. Why is this so important to you? I mean, beyond the obvious reasons, there's something personal in the way you talk about these issues. Marcus looked out at the city, at the lights that represented millions of lives, millions of stories. When I was teaching, I had a student named Devin. Brilliant kid, but he was being abused at home. I reported it like I was supposed to. But his father had connections, and the investigation got buried. What happened? I kept pushing, kept trying to protect him. Eventually, they found a way to get rid of me. Devin aged out of the system, and last I heard, he was in jail. Catherine was quiet, waiting for him to continue. I failed him, Marcus said simply. I had the training, the knowledge, the responsibility to protect him, and I failed. Now I have another chance to help kids like Devin, but this time I have resources, power, influence. If I fail again, it's not because I didn't have the tools to succeed. And if you succeed, Then maybe Devon's story doesn't have to be repeated for other kids. Catherine reached over and took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a promise. We won't fail, she said. How can you be sure? Because we're not doing this alone, and because we're not doing it for the right reasons, we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. As they walked back to the parking garage, Marcus felt a sense of possibility that he hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow, he would finish his recommendations for the board meeting. Friday, he would present them to a room full of skeptical executives. But tonight, he allowed himself to believe that change was possible. The next morning brought a crisis that would test that belief. Marcus arrived at his office to find Sarah waiting for him with a grim expression. We have a problem, she said. What kind of problem? The kind that involves lawyers and newspaper reporters. Sarah handed him a copy of the Chicago Tribune. The headline read, Sterling Enterprises hires unqualified driver for $120,000 community role. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he read the article. It detailed his background, his dismissal from teaching, and raised questions about his qualifications for his new position. The article included quotes from anonymous sources questioning whether Sterling Enterprises was serious about community investment or simply engaging in public relations. How did they get this information? Marcus asked. I don't know, but Miss Sterling wants to see you immediately. Marcus walked to Catherine's office, feeling like he was walking to his execution. She was on the phone when he entered, her voice sharp with controlled anger. I don't care what your source says, she was saying. The story is misleading and irresponsible. No, I won't comment on personnel decisions. Yes, I understand you have a job to do, but so do I. She hung up and looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't read. I'm sorry, he said. I should have been more upfront about what? About the fact that you were fired for trying to protect a child? About the fact that you've been working multiple jobs to support your daughter? About the fact that you have more real-world experience with these issues than anyone else in this building? Marcus blinked. You're not firing me? I'm not firing you, but I am going to ask you to do something that might be even harder. What's that? Catherine stood up, her expression fierce with determination. I'm going to ask you to walk into that board meeting tomorrow and tell them exactly who you are and why that matters. No apologies, no explanations, no defensiveness, just the truth. And if they decide I'm not qualified, then they'll be making a mistake that will cost them the best opportunity they've ever had to do something meaningful. Marcus looked at her, seeing not just the CEO, but the woman who had chosen to trust him when no one else would. Okay, he said, let's do this. But as he returned to his office to prepare for the most important presentation of his life, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that someone had deliberately leaked his information to the press. And if that was true, it meant he had an enemy who was willing to play dirty to stop Sterling Enterprises' community investment initiative. The question was, who and what were they willing to do next? The Sterling Enterprises boardroom was a monument to corporate power, a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, oil paintings of past CEOs, and windows that offered a commanding view of downtown Chicago. Marcus had never felt smaller than he did walking into that room on Friday morning, carrying his presentation folder and trying to project confidence he didn't feel. The board members were already seated when he arrived. Marcus recognized some of them from the various events he'd attended with Catherine, successful men and women in their 50s and 60s who had built careers on making smart investments and avoiding unnecessary risks. At the head of the table sat Catherine, her expression carefully neutral. To her right was Victoria Nash, who offered Marcus a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, Catherine began, I'd like to formally introduce Marcus Thompson, our new Director of Community Engagement. Marcus will be presenting his preliminary recommendations for our Community Investment Initiative. Marcus stood, feeling the weight of scrutiny from around the table. Someone had clearly briefed them on the newspaper article because he could see the skepticism in their faces. Thank you, Miss Sterling, he began, his voice steadier than he felt. Before I present my recommendations, I want to address something directly. He paused, looking around the table. I'm sure you've all read the Tribune article about my background. Everything in that article is true. I was fired from my teaching position for trying to protect a student from abuse. I have been working as a driver to support my daughter. I don't have an MBA or a background in corporate social responsibility. The room was silent, waiting. What the article didn't mention, Marcus continued, is that I spent 15 years working in communities that Sterling Enterprises wants to invest in. I've seen what works and what doesn't. I know the difference between programs that make corporations feel good and programs that actually change lives. He opened his presentation folder. Over the past week, I've met with community leaders, school principals, and nonprofit directors. I've listened to what they actually need, not what we think they need. And I've developed a set of recommendations that I believe will make a real difference. Marcus clicked to his first slide, which showed a map of Chicago with various neighborhoods highlighted. Traditional corporate community investment focuses on high-visibility projects, new buildings, technology donations, scholarship programs. These aren't bad things, but they often miss the fundamental barriers that keep families in poverty. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a web of interconnected issues. The number one barrier to employment in underserved communities is transportation. People can't work if they can't get to work. The number two barrier is childcare, especially for parents working non-traditional hours. The number three barrier is basic financial literacy, understanding how to open bank accounts, build credit, navigate bureaucracy. Board member Robert Chen, a man in his 60s who had built a manufacturing empire, leaned forward. These sound like social services, not business investments. They are business investments, Marcus replied. Every person who gains stable employment becomes a consumer, a taxpayer, a community member who contributes to economic growth. Every child who graduates from high school, instead of dropping out, represents decades of increased economic productivity. But what are the measurable outcomes? Asked Patricia Williams, a woman who had made her fortune in real estate development. How do we track return on investment? Marcus had been expecting this question. We track it the same way we track any long-term investment. Employment rates, educational achievement, crime statistics, property values, local business revenue, but we measure success over years, not quarters. Victoria Nash spoke up. Mr. Thompson, these are admirable goals, but Sterling Enterprises has shareholders who expect returns. How do we justify spending $50 million on programs that might not show results for years? Because, Marcus said, meeting her gaze directly, the cost of not investing is higher than the cost of investing. How much does it cost society when a child drops out of school? How much does it cost when families can't find stable employment? How much does it cost when communities are trapped in cycles of poverty? He clicked to his next slide, which showed specific program proposals. I'm recommending that we start with 3 pilot programs. First, a transportation cooperative that provides reliable, affordable transportation to job sites. Second, a childcare network that operates during non-traditional hours. Third, a financial literacy and small business development program. Board member David Kim, a tech entrepreneur, raised his hand. What makes you think these programs will succeed where others have failed? Because they're designed by people who understand the problems from the inside. Each program will be staffed primarily by community members, people who have lived these challenges and overcome them. They'll be paid living wages, not volunteer stipends. Marcus could see interest growing around the table, but he could also see skepticism. Let me give you a specific example, he continued. The Southside Community Center serves 500 families, but they could serve 1,000 if they had better transportation options. Maria Santos, the director, has identified exactly what's needed. A van service that runs between the community center and major job sites, operating during shift changes. He clicked to the next slide, which showed detailed budget projections. The cost to implement this service is $200,000 annually. But if it helps 200 additional people find stable employment, the increased tax revenue alone would pay for the program within 3 years. That's assuming the program actually works, Victoria interjected. What if it doesn't? Marcus turned to her. Then we modify it until it does. That's what pilot programs are for, to test, adjust, and improve. But at what cost? Victoria pressed. How many failed experiments are we willing to fund? How many successful experiments are we willing to miss because we're afraid of failure? Marcus shot back. The room fell silent. Marcus realized he'd spoken more sharply than he'd intended, but the words were out now. Catherine spoke up. Marcus, can you tell us about the timeline for implementation? Phase 1 would begin in 6 months, with all 3 pilot programs launching simultaneously. We'd collect data for 18 months, then use that data to decide which programs to expand and which to modify. And the total budget? Asked Robert Chen. $15 million over 3 years for the pilot programs. If they succeed, we'd expand to a full $50 million investment over 5 years. The questions continued for another hour. Marcus answered them as best he could, drawing on his research and his conversations with community leaders. But he could feel the tension in the room, the division between those who saw potential and those who saw risk. Finally, Catherine called for a break. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes to discuss the proposal. Marcus gathered his materials, unsure whether he'd succeeded or failed. As board members filed out, several stopped to speak with him. "Interesting presentation," said Patricia Williams. "I appreciate the specificity of your recommendations." "Thank you. I have to ask, though, are you prepared for the possibility that some of these programs might not work, that we might have to shut them down?" Marcus met her eyes. "I'm prepared for the possibility that we might have to adjust them, but I'm not prepared to accept that we shouldn't try." After the board members left, Marcus found himself alone with Catherine and Victoria. "That was quite a performance," Victoria said, her tone carefully neutral. "It wasn't a performance," Marcus replied. "It was a presentation of facts and recommendations." "Of course. I just hope you understand that passion doesn't always translate into practical results." Catherine stepped between them. "I think we should let the board deliberate without trying to influence their decision." Victoria smiled. "Absolutely. May the best ideas win." As Victoria left, Catherine turned to Marcus. "How do you think it went?" "I think I made some people angry, and some people think. I'm not sure which group is larger." "The thinking group," Catherine said. "Trust me. And if I'm wrong? If they vote down the proposal?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll find another way." "But Marcus, regardless of what happens, you did something important in there. You made them see these issues as human problems, not abstract policy questions. Will that be enough?" "It's a start." They waited in Catherine's office while the board deliberated. Marcus tried to read, but he couldn't focus. Catherine made phone calls, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. After what felt like hours, Sarah appeared in the doorway. "They're ready for you," she said. Back in the boardroom, the board members looked serious, but not hostile. Catherine took her seat at the head of the table, and Marcus stood beside her. Robert Chen spoke first. "Marcus, we've discussed your proposal extensively. We have concerns about the timeline, the budget, and the measurability of outcomes." Marcus felt his heart sink. "However," Chen continued, "we also recognize that Sterling Enterprises has an opportunity to be a leader in corporate community investment. We're prepared to approve a modified version of your proposal." Marcus blinked. "Modified how?" Patricia Williams answered. "We're approving 2 of your 3 pilot programs, the Transportation Cooperative and the Financial Literacy Program. We're reducing the initial budget to $10 million over 2 years. If those programs show measurable success, we'll consider expanding to include the Child Care Network and additional funding." It wasn't everything Marcus had asked for, but it was more than he dared hope for when he'd walked into the room. "There's one condition," Victoria added. "The programs must show clear, measurable progress within the first year. If they don't, funding will be redirected to other initiatives." Marcus looked at Catherine, who nodded slightly. "I accept those terms," he said. "Then congratulations," said David Kim. "You've just become responsible for Sterling Enterprises' most ambitious community investment initiative." As the meeting broke up, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and terror. He'd gotten approval for the programs, but he'd also committed to results that weren't entirely under his control. Catherine found him in the hallway afterward. "How are you feeling?" "Like I just signed up to either change the world or fail spectacularly in front of everyone." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Catherine said with a smile. "Sometimes you have to risk spectacular failure to achieve meaningful change. And if I fail, then you'll fail trying to do something that matters." "But Marcus?" "Yeah, you're not going to fail, because you're not doing this alone." As they walked back to their offices, Marcus felt a sense of possibility that he hadn't experienced since his teaching days. He had resources, support, and a chance to make a real difference in people's lives. But he also had a nagging feeling that Victoria Nash's opposition to the programs was more than just philosophical disagreement. Something in her tone, her questions, her smile, suggested that she was already planning for his failure. The question was she planning to let him fail, or was she planning to help him fail? Marcus was about to find out that the answer would determine not just the fate of the Community Investment Initiative, but his own future at Sterling Enterprises. The morning Marcus was supposed to break ground on the first Sterling Enterprises Community Transportation Cooperative, he woke up to his phone buzzing with 17 missed calls. The first was from Catherine, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Marcus, call me as soon as you get this. We have a situation." The second was from Maria Santos at the Southside Community Center, her usually calm voice edged with confusion and hurt. "Marcus, I don't understand what's happening. The Tribune is saying the transportation program is being investigated for fraud." "What fraud?" "We haven't even started yet." Marcus sat up in bed, his heart racing. Emma was still asleep in the next room, and he tried to keep his voice low as he called Catherine back. "What the hell is going on?" he asked when she answered. "Someone leaked preliminary budget documents to the press," Catherine said. "They're claiming the transportation program is a front for funneling money to your friends in the community. That's insane. The budget documents aren't even finalized yet." "I know that. You know that. But the Tribune is running with a story that suggests Sterling Enterprises is being taken advantage of by an inexperienced director who's more interested in helping his cronies than creating legitimate programs." Marcus felt the familiar cold dread settling in his stomach. This is about more than budget documents, isn't it? There's more. Someone also provided the reporter with information about your salary, your housing situation, Emma's medical expenses. They're painting a picture of a desperate man who took a job he wasn't qualified for. Who has access to that information? HR, payroll, senior executives. Catherine's voice was heavy with implication. "Marcus, I think someone inside Sterling Enterprises is trying to sabotage the program." "Victoria, I can't prove it, but yes, I think so." "And Marcus? There's something else. The board is calling an emergency meeting this afternoon. They want to review the entire Community Investment Initiative." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 17 missed calls and the lives that hung in the balance. "Are they going to shut it down?" "I don't know. But I need you to come in early. We need to prepare for the worst." An hour later, Marcus sat in Catherine's office, reading the Tribune article that was systematically destroying everything they'd built. The headline read, "Sterling Enterprises Community Program. Charity or Cronyism." The article was devastating in its implications, suggesting that Marcus had designed the programs to benefit his personal contacts rather than the broader community. "It's all true and all false at the same time," Marcus said, setting the paper down. "Yes, I know Maria Santos. Yes, I recommended hiring community members to run the programs. Yes, I've been struggling financially. But the conclusions they're drawing are character assassination disguised as journalism," Catherine finished. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Before Marcus could answer, Sarah knocked on the door. "Miss Sterling? There's a woman here to see Mr. Thompson. She says it's urgent. Send her in." The woman who entered was someone Marcus hadn't seen in 3 years, but her presence hit him like a physical blow. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had been the principal at Lincoln Elementary when Marcus was fired, and she'd been one of the few administrators who had supported his efforts to protect Devon. "Rebecca," Marcus said, standing, "what are you doing here?" "I came to tell you that you're not alone in this fight," she replied, her voice carrying the authority that had made her one of Chicago's most respected educators. "And I came to tell you something about Devon that you need to know." Catherine gestured for Rebecca to sit. "Please, tell us what you know." Rebecca looked at Marcus with an expression that was part compassion, part determination. "Devon didn't disappear into the system the way everyone thinks. After you were fired, he aged out of foster care, but he didn't go to jail. He got his GED, went to community college, and now he's working as a youth counselor." Marcus felt his breath catch. "What?" "He's been working with kids who've been through the system, helping them navigate the same challenges he faced. And Marcus, he's been telling people for years that you saved his life. But I failed him. I couldn't protect him from..." You couldn't protect him from his father, Rebecca interrupted, but you protected him from giving up on himself. The attention you gave him, the belief you showed in him, the way you fought for him even when it cost you your job, that's what kept him going. Marcus felt tears burning his eyes. Why are you telling me this now? Because Devin saw the Tribune article this morning. He's been trying to reach you. Rebecca handed Marcus a folded piece of paper. He wanted me to give you this. Marcus opened the letter, recognizing the careful handwriting of someone who had taught himself to write with precision and purpose. Mr. Thompson, I saw the newspaper today and I got angry. Not at you, but at the people trying to tear down what you're building. You probably don't remember, but you once told me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're afraid. I've been working with kids for 5 years now, and I tell every one of them about the teacher who lost his job because he wouldn't let a kid fall through the cracks. I tell them that there are adults who will fight for them even when it's hard. Don't let them stop you. The kids you're trying to help need you to be as stubborn as you were with me. Thank you for saving my life. Devin Williams. Marcus read the letter twice, then looked up at Rebecca. He's really okay? He's more than okay. He's thriving. And he's not the only one. There are 15 other students from your classes who have gone on to college, careers, meaningful lives. They remember the teacher who believed in them. Catherine leaned forward. Miss Martinez, would you be willing to speak to our board about Marcus's track record as an educator? I'd be honored to, but there's something else you should know. Rebecca's expression grew more serious. I've been doing some research since I saw the Tribune article. The reporter who wrote it, Janet Crawford, has written 3 similar hit pieces in the past 2 years, all targeting community programs that threatened existing power structures. What do you mean? Marcus asked. I mean, someone is paying her to write these stories. And if you dig into the sources she quotes, you'll find they're all connected to the same network of corporate interests that profit from keeping communities underserved. Catherine and Marcus exchanged glances. Can you prove that? Catherine asked. I can prove that Janet Crawford has received consulting fees from firms that represent payday loan companies, private prison operators, and charter school networks, all industries that profit from community instability. Marcus felt a surge of anger. So this isn't just about me or Sterling Enterprises. It's about stopping community investment programs altogether. Exactly. And it's working. 3 programs in the past 2 years have been shut down after Crawford's articles, even though they were showing positive results. Catherine stood up, pacing to the window. Then we need to fight back, not just defend ourselves, but expose what's really happening. How? Marcus asked. By telling the truth. By showing the board and the public exactly what these programs are meant to accomplish and who's trying to stop them. Rebecca smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Because Devin isn't the only one who wants to help. I've been in touch with other students, other teachers, other community leaders. They're all willing to speak up. Marcus felt a spark of hope. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that when you walk into that board meeting this afternoon, you don't go alone. You bring the community with you. The Sterling Enterprises boardroom had never held so many people. By 2 p.m., every seat was filled, and additional chairs had been brought in to accommodate the overflow. Marcus sat at the head of the table with Catherine, but around them were faces he'd never expected to see in a corporate boardroom. Maria Santos from the Community Center, Principal Janet Williams from Lincoln Elementary, Devon Williams, now a confident young man of 24, and a dozen other community members, former students and local leaders. Victoria Nash sat at the far end of the table, her expression carefully neutral, but Marcus could see the tension in her posture. She'd clearly expected a simple board meeting where she could present her case for shutting down the Community Investment Initiative. Instead, she was facing a room full of people who had personal stakes in the program's success. Robert Chen called the meeting to order. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to address the concerns raised in this morning's Tribune article and to determine the future of Sterling Enterprises' community investment programs. Before we begin, Catherine said, standing, I want to address the elephant in the room. The Tribune article was based on selectively leaked information designed to create a false narrative. We have evidence that suggests this leak was coordinated with similar attacks on other community programs. Victoria spoke up. Catherine, I understand you're trying to protect your initiative, but we can't ignore legitimate concerns about fiscal responsibility and program oversight. You're right, Marcus said, also standing. We can't ignore those concerns, but we also can't ignore the fact that someone is trying to destroy these programs before they even begin. He gestured to the people around the table. I'd like you to meet some of the people who would be affected by that destruction. Devin Williams was the first to speak. He stood with the confidence of someone who had overcome enormous odds and found his purpose. My name is Devin Williams, he began, his voice clear and strong. 15 years ago, I was a kid in the foster care system being abused by my placement family. Mr. Thompson was my history teacher, and he was the first adult who noticed that something was wrong. The room was completely silent. When he reported the abuse, his career was destroyed. But he kept fighting for me, kept believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. That's the kind of person you're being asked to trust with your community investment programs. Devin looked directly at Victoria. I've read the Tribune article. It suggests that Mr. Thompson is unqualified, that he's looking out for his friends instead of the community. I'm here to tell you that's exactly backward. Mr. Thompson lost his job because he put a child's welfare above his own career security. That's not a character flaw. That's the qualification that matters most. Maria Santos spoke next. I've been running community programs for 20 years. I've seen a lot of corporations come through our neighborhood with promises and good intentions. Most of them disappear when the photo opportunities are over. She looked around the table. Marcus Thompson is different. He came to our center not to take pictures but to listen. He sat with our families, learned their names, understood their struggles. The transportation program he's proposing? It's not his idea, it's theirs. He just figured out how to make it happen. Principal Janet Williams stood next. I've been in education for 30 years, and I've seen a lot of people who think they can fix schools from the outside. Most of them have never spent a day in a classroom with 30 kids, limited resources, and constant budget cuts. She looked directly at the board members. Marcus Thompson spent 15 years in those classrooms. He knows what works and what doesn't. More importantly, he knows that successful programs are built with communities, not imposed on them. One by one, the community members spoke. A mother talked about how the transportation program would allow her to take a job that would lift her family out of poverty. A teenager described how the financial literacy program could help him start a business instead of turning to illegal activities. A grandmother explained how the child care network would allow her daughter to work while her grandchildren stayed safe. When they finished, the room was silent except for the sound of people breathing and thinking. Victoria Nash finally spoke. These are moving stories, but they don't address the fundamental question of fiscal responsibility. How do we know these programs will produce measurable results? Because we're going to measure them, Marcus replied. Not just with statistics, but with lives changed, families stabilized, communities strengthened. That's not enough for our shareholders, Victoria pressed. They expect returns on investment. Then let's talk about returns, said a new voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Richard Whitmore entering the boardroom, followed by Eleanor Whitmore and two other people Marcus didn't recognize. Richard, Catherine said, clearly surprised. I didn't expect you. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Richard replied, taking a seat. But when I heard about this meeting, I felt I needed to be here. He looked around the table, his gaze stopping on Victoria. I've been following the Tribune article and the response to it. I've also been doing some research of my own. Richard pulled out a folder. Janet Crawford, the reporter who wrote the article, has a history of writing hit pieces on community programs. She's been paid consulting fees by companies that profit from community instability. Victoria's face went pale. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation, Richard replied. Someone is trying to manipulate Sterling Enterprises into abandoning programs that could transform communities. The question is, who benefits from that manipulation? He looked directly at Victoria. I've also discovered that you've been in contact with several investment firms that specialize in private prison construction and payday lending operations. Firms that would be negatively affected by successful community investment programs. The room erupted in murmurs and shocked whispers. Victoria stood up, her composure finally cracking. This is ridiculous, she said. You're suggesting that I sabotaged our own programs? I'm suggesting that you had a motive to do so, Richard replied calmly. You've been planning to leave Sterling Enterprises to start your own consulting firm, specializing in advising companies on how to avoid costly community investment programs. Catherine stared at Victoria in shock. Is that true? Victoria's silence was answer enough. Victoria, Robert Chen said, his voice heavy with disappointment, if you've been working against Sterling Enterprises' interests while employed by the company, that's a serious breach of fiduciary duty. I was trying to protect the company from a costly mistake, Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. You were trying to protect your own financial interests, Richard corrected, and you were willing to destroy Marcus Thompson's reputation and Sterling Enterprises' community programs to do it. The room fell silent again. Finally, Catherine spoke. Victoria, I think you need to clean out your office. Victoria looked around the table, seeing no support, no sympathy, no allies. You're making a mistake, she said. These programs will fail, and when they do, you'll wish you'd listened to me. Maybe, Marcus said quietly, but we'd rather fail trying to help people than succeed by exploiting them. Victoria gathered her things and left the room, her heels clicking angrily on the marble floor. After she was gone, Robert Chen addressed the room. Given what we've learned today, I think we need to revisit our decision about the community investment programs. What are you suggesting? Catherine asked. I'm suggesting that we approve the full $50 million investment over 5 years, with Marcus Thompson as the director and with the community partnerships he's proposed. The vote was unanimous. As the meeting broke up, Marcus found himself surrounded by community members, board members, and Sterling Enterprises employees, all wanting to congratulate him and discuss the programs. But he was looking for Catherine, who had stepped out during the celebration. He found her in her office, standing at the window, looking out at the city. How are you feeling? He asked. Relieved, angry, hopeful, scared. She turned to him. Victoria was right about one thing. These programs could fail. And if they do, it's not just money we'll lose. It's trust, credibility, the belief that business can be a force for good. They won't fail, Marcus said. How can you be sure? Because we're not building them for shareholders or board members or newspaper articles. We're building them for Devin, for Maria, for Emma, for all the kids who need adults to believe in them. Catherine smiled. You know, my father used to say that the best investments are the ones that pay dividends in human potential. Smart man. He would have liked you. Marcus stepped closer to her. Catherine, there's something I need to tell you. What's that? I'm falling in love with you. She blinked in surprise. Marcus, I know it's complicated. I know we work together. I know there are power dynamics and professional considerations. But I also know that the past few months have been the best of my life, not just because of the work we're doing, but because of who I get to do it with. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Do you remember what you said to me that first night? That you'd rather fail trying to matter than succeed by playing it safe? I remember. I've been playing it safe my whole life. Safe relationships, safe decisions, safe investments. But nothing safe has ever made me feel the way I feel when I'm with you. She stepped closer to him. I'm falling in love with you too, Marcus Thompson, and that terrifies me and thrills me and makes me want to be braver than I've ever been. This time, when they kissed, it wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was the kiss of two people who had found something worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. When they broke apart, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. So what happens now? Now we build something beautiful together. The programs, the relationship, the life we want to live. And if people say we're moving too fast, Catherine smiled. Then we'll tell them that when you find something real, you don't waste time pretending it's not. 6 months later, Marcus stood in front of the newly renovated Southside Community Center, watching as the first Sterling Enterprises community transportation van pulled up to the curb. The van was filled with community members heading to jobs, training programs, and opportunities that had been out of reach just months before. Emma stood beside him, her inhaler in her pocket but her breathing clear and strong. The new health insurance had allowed them to get better medication, and the stable income had reduced the stress that had been triggering her attacks. Daddy, she said, tugging on his sleeve, is this what changing the world looks like? Marcus looked around at the scene. Maria Santos greeting the van passengers, Devin Williams leading a group of teenagers in a financial literacy workshop, community members who had been hired as program coordinators helping families navigate services. It's what changing the world looks like, one person at a time, he replied. Catherine appeared beside them, having just finished a meeting with the mayor about expanding the programs to other neighborhoods. She slipped her hand into Marcus's, and Emma grabbed her other hand. Are we ready? Catherine asked. For what? Marcus replied. For the next phase. The board approved funding for 10 more neighborhoods, and they want to create a model that other cities can replicate. Marcus felt a familiar mixture of excitement and terror. That's a lot of responsibility. It's a lot of opportunity, Catherine corrected, and we're not doing it alone. As they walked toward the community center, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, he'd been a struggling single father driving strangers around the city, trying to make ends meet. Now he was the director of a program that was transforming lives across Chicago, in love with a woman who challenged him to be better, and part of a community that was proving that business could be a force for good. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, criticism, moments when the program seemed like they might fail. But each time, they'd adjusted, learned, and kept moving forward. Marcus, Catherine said as they reached the community center doors, there's something I need to tell you. What's that? The Chicago Tribune wants to do a follow-up story about the success of the programs, about Victoria's attempts to sabotage them, about the model we've created. Marcus smiled. And what are you going to tell them? The truth. That sometimes the most important investments are the ones that pay dividends in human potential. That real leadership means listening to people who have been ignored. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're afraid. Emma looked up at them. Are you going to be in the newspaper again? Maybe, Marcus replied. But this time, it'll be a story about what we built together, not what someone tried to tear down. As they entered the community center, Marcus was struck by the energy in the room. People were learning, growing, building better lives for themselves and their families. Children were playing while their parents attended classes. Teenagers were working on projects that would help them get into college or start careers. It was messy, complicated, and imperfect, but it was real, and it was working. That evening, as Marcus tucked Emma into bed in their new apartment, still modest, but in a better neighborhood with better schools, she asked him the question that had been on his mind as well. Daddy, what happens next? Marcus thought about the expansion plans, the other cities that wanted to replicate their model, the marriage proposal he'd been working up the courage to make to Catherine. Next, we keep building, he said. We keep helping people, keep learning, keep growing, and we remember that the most important thing isn't how big we get, but how many lives we touch along the way. Emma nodded solemnly. And we stay together, you and me and Catherine, forever and always, Marcus promised. As Emma drifted off to sleep, Marcus sat in his small home office, looking over plans for the next phase of community investment programs. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. Thank you for teaching me that love and leadership aren't about being perfect. They're about being real. He texted back, thank you for teaching me that second chances are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you. Marcus looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, at the city that had broken him down and built him back up. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to make a difference. But tonight, he was exactly where he belonged, building something meaningful with someone he loved, raising a daughter who understood that changing the world was possible, one person at a time. The story that had begun with a desperate phone call and a borrowed tuxedo had become something neither Marcus nor Catherine could have imagined. It had become a love story, a success story, and a testament to the power of choosing courage over comfort, partnership over profit, and hope over fear. And in the end, that was the most important lesson of all, that the most transformative investments are the ones we make in each other. The wedding was held in the garden behind the Southside Community Center, surrounded by sunflowers that the children had planted as part of their urban agriculture program. Marcus stood at the altar in his best suit. Not rented this time, but purchased with his own money, a symbol of how far he'd come. Catherine walked down the aisle not to the traditional wedding march, but to a song performed by the community center's youth choir. Her dress was elegant but not extravagant, and her smile was radiant with the joy of someone who had found exactly where she belonged. Emma served as the ring bearer, her small hands carefully carrying the symbols of her father's and Catherine's commitment to each other. Devin Williams, now pursuing a master's degree in social work, served as Marcus's best man, Maria Santos, who had become Catherine's closest friend and advisor, stood as maid of honor. The officiant was Judge Patricia Williams, the Sterling Enterprises board member, who had become one of the community investment program's strongest advocates. As she spoke about love, commitment, and the power of partnership, Marcus looked out at the assembled crowd. There were Sterling Enterprises employees sitting next to community members. Former students of Marcus's sat beside business leaders. Children who had been helped by the programs played quietly while their parents watched the ceremony. It was a gathering that would have been impossible a year ago, when Marcus was just a struggling driver and Catherine was just a lonely CEO. But love had a way of breaking down barriers, of bringing together people who might never have met otherwise. Marcus, Judge Williams, said, "Do you take Catherine to be your wife, to stand beside her in success and struggle, to build a life together based on mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to keep growing?" "I do," Marcus replied, his voice strong and clear. "Catherine, do you take Marcus to be your husband, to stand beside him in success and struggle, to build a life together based on mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to keep growing?" "I do," Catherine replied, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Illinois, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The kiss was gentle, joyful, and full of promise. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and Emma jumped up and down with excitement. As they walked back down the aisle together, Marcus caught sight of the banner that the community center children had made. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. Thank you for believing in us." The reception was held in the community center's main hall, with food prepared by local restaurants that had been supported by the Small Business Development Program. The speeches were heartfelt and personal, filled with stories of transformation and hope. Richard Whitmore spoke about the power of authentic leadership. Devin Williams talked about the importance of adults who refuse to give up on young people. Maria Santos shared her vision of what communities could accomplish when they were given resources and respect. But the most moving speech came from Emma, who had insisted on speaking even though she was only 7 years old. "My daddy used to be sad a lot," she said, standing on a chair so everyone could see her. "He tried to hide it, but I could tell. He was sad because he wanted to help people, but he couldn't." The room was completely silent, hanging on every word. But then he met Catherine, and she gave him a chance to help people again, and now he's not sad anymore. He's happy, and he's helping lots of people, and we're a family. She paused, looking around the room with the seriousness that children sometimes possess. "I think that's what love is. It's when people help each other be the best they can be, and it's when they don't give up on each other, even when things are hard." The applause was thunderous, but Marcus barely heard it. He was too busy looking at his daughter, amazed by her wisdom and grateful for the journey that had brought them all together. As the evening wound down, Marcus and Catherine found themselves on the community center's rooftop, looking out over the neighborhood that had become their shared mission. "Any regrets?" Catherine asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "Only that it took us so long to find each other," Marcus replied. "And what happens now?" Marcus smiled. "Now we keep building. The programs, the family, the life we want to live, and we remember that the most important investments are the ones that pay dividends in human potential." Catherine kissed him softly. "I love you, Marcus Thompson." "I love you too, Catherine Thompson." As they stood together on the rooftop, surrounded by the city that had tested them and ultimately embraced them, Marcus reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them to this moment. A desperate phone call, a borrowed tuxedo, and a speech that had shocked a room full of powerful people had led to love, family, and the chance to make a real difference in the world. It was, he realized, the best possible ending to a story that had begun with two people who had lost their way and found each other. But it was also, he knew, just the beginning of the next chapter in their lives together.